But it's lovely to be here today. And as just said, I am with the OECD and OPSI fairly recently, about the last 10 months now in Paris. And prior to that, yeah, spent about 15 or 16 years within the Australian government or advising to the government as well. Sorry, yes, I'm a bit short, aren't I, for the camera? In various different roles. So Joss mentioned in the last couple of years prior to moving to the OECD, I was Assistant Commissioner for Design at the Tax Office, and I'll draw a little bit on that because we did some interesting things there around bringing in some of that systems work into the tax office. Tax never sounds very sexy, but I promise you it is. And prior to that, I spent a lot of time more in the social policy space. I'll talk a little bit about that too. But here in the OECD, my main role is around thinking about how do you build the capacity of government systems to be innovative. Often we talk about, I think, innovation as quite a separate concept. You know, how do you have an innovation strategy? Do you have an innovation award? Do you have an innovation lab? And I think for governments to really build that muscle and flex that muscle, we really need to examine the systems that they work in. So I'm really passionate about that, and that's also where my studies sit at the moment, attempting or failing semi to attempt to do my doctorate here at the moment. So, but it's been an amazing journey to work in the public service and being in the service of public. I truly love it. But first, I have a question. Does any of you work in government in this room? Yep, sort of. Does anyone work with government? Okay, are we primarily in the private sector or in consulting? Yep, in the academic sector, in the NGOs, that type of sector, in some kind of other sector. Okay, super. So we have a mix, but generally you're working with government. Because today I wanted to talk a little bit about how do we build the capacity of public sectors and government in the realm of systems innovation and systems thinking. So I won't spend too much time on it, but I think we all have heard the terms like VUCA. You know, we're living in a very complex world with the volatility, uncertainty, ambiguity. I think, you know, globalization, the internet, data advancements, things like this are starting to contribute to that as well. And unless you're in Australia, who I don't know if they've forgotten about COVID, but here in Europe, it seems a bit more forgotten about. So I don't always like to go back to it, but I think it did really highlight, not just for governments, but for us personally, just that level of interconnectedness, the level of change that it put, the level of demand that it put on governments, on each of us to change the way we even thought about work, how we socially interact, communities and things like this. And these sorts of issues are well and truly prevalent outside of a crisis. So the issues we deal with today, they've gone from local to national to global scales. They're far more interconnected, where they used to be a little bit more siloed in terms of the challenges governments are thinking about. And further, things are happening at a much faster pace of change because we are so connected now. And many of today's biggest challenges that public sectors are grappling with, climate change, gender equity, migration issues, countering terrorism, these sorts of issues are what we can call these wicked or complex problems, right? They're highly complex. What they are, the problem is many, many definitions, and many people think about them in very different ways. They deal with complex systems that change in ways that are unexpected. Every time we intervene, we do things, the system starts to adapt, and those policy challenges are really, really tough to tackle. And there's numerous actors playing in them. Often we think about the role of government, and government thinks about the role of themselves, but really government is just one actor in a very, very big ecosystem of work that has to deal with these types of issues and these types of systems as well. And also what we do in these can have unintended consequences. That often is not a good thing, or sounds with a negative connotation, but it can also have positive unintended consequences. In the tax office, we used to use a little cute story. It's a bit flippant, but a long time ago when Google Maps, you know, just started coming out, and you could actually see the Earth view, people's houses and things like this. In Greece, they were wondering, how do we think about a novel way of taxing? How do we innovate in the tax system? And they thought, well, what about taxing people with swimming pools? We can now see the swimming pools from Google Earth. They must be very wealthy, let's start taxing them. The thing they didn't realize would be how much the sales of grass-looking pool covers would go up in recent times. So that's obviously a very, very silly story there from the tax office that we use. But I think it just highlights that the things that we do might have effects, positive or negative, that we're just not thinking about. And we need to be open to these types of things. So systems innovation, I think most of you are probably converts in this space already if you are here. I think we're going to have some tech people coming in as well. It is a whole of systems approach that is, no worries. No. Please turn that. Go for it.
Sorry, let's just press the button.
Sorry. No, I'm not sure, but I'll let Joss attempt. Joss, we just needed to press a button, it seems.
Okay, that's simple. Huh?
Okay, so I can. Thank you. Wonderful. I am completely tech illiterate, and it seems Joss is. Yeah, you have to press the big button that had a green button on it, the big button. So systems innovation really is about taking that holistic approach, and it really is about trying to examine, not just the parts, but the whole. And for government, this means things like not just implementing policies or new services or things like that, but starting to try and get under the hood, starting to try to understand those underlying interactions, those underlying mental models, the structures, the information flows, the rules, the things that happen within the system that start to produce what's going on. For me, I don't like to define exactly what systems innovation is. I think it's pluralistic. There's many methods: systems thinking, complexity theory, innovation, lots of different methods, and every one of you will be exposed to that in some kind of way. And I actually think sometimes we do a bit of a disservice in the systems community, being a bit too dogmatic about what these types of things are. But there is growing awareness in government and in public sectors that the types of challenges that they're facing are fundamentally complex and fundamentally challenging, and they do require a different type of approach. And I do think in governments now, there is not just an awareness, but there is starting to be a practice and application now of approaches such as systems-based approaches. Systems thinking, design thinking, more collaborative types of models of doing policy making. And I don't want to spend too much time on the reason it needs to be there, because as I said, I think this community is well aware of that. But the point, however, for me is for governments, I think one of the biggest challenges is that despite this awareness, despite the starting of this practice, government systems as a whole are ill-equipped to deal with these challenges. And these types of approaches and complexity in policy challenges mean a lot for government, for policy making, for public services. It really redefines the way we think about policies. We think about the purpose of the system. I remember working in Australia in the Department of Employment, and it was interesting there, because if you ask one person, the goal of that system was about creating more jobs. You ask someone else, it was about making sure we reduce the unemployment rate. If you ask someone else, it was about the welfare system. I think, Sharon, you actually did a lot of work there after I was there. So you'd probably know more of the recent side of things there. But that purpose of the system is really important. How we understand success and how we understand what we're trying to achieve, the directions we're trying to shift the system in. It also helps us think about how parts come together. And in government, this is important because we're usually divided in functional silos. And systems approaches helps us think about those interactions. It also helps us think about rethinking about dealing with complex issues. And actually for governments, one of the things that I think is really important for them, because accountability risk spending is a big thing that we can't remove from their system, is that it can help to de-risk those solutions. And ultimately for governments, I think it's a necessity in terms of being able to deal with the desires and the hopes and the goals of citizens as well. But as such, I think governments need to really start fundamentally rethinking how they are operating in order to do these types of system-based change. Just, I think the slide at the moment is talking about innovation. Innovating parts isn't enough. We must strive for innovating whole systems. I think in government, the notion of public sector innovation is not new. It's been around for a long time. But one of the things that we see in the OECD is generally the main types of innovations we see in public sectors are really around innovating parts. And it's not a bad thing. We need to do that as well. But there are some challenges with this, that wrong purpose. It can have a temporary effect. It might be not enough to disrupt or actually start to shift the underlying structures within the system for a sustained effect. We've talked a little bit about unintended consequences and effects that they're not aware of, because these are always going to be there. The systems are going to adapt and change. And we often see things like new apps. It's probably the biggest thing we hear about in government, a new app or a new website. Who knows what it's for, but here it is. Look at a fancy new app. Or a new product, a new e-vehicle. I think Joss has actually done a great presentation. Was it you or someone else on 3D printers, for example, a new process to make something more efficient. But if we really want to transform the system, we do need to start thinking about more than just those policies or products or services or things like this. And there's a whole range of examples that that are out there, and systems innovation, and Joss has shared many, including, for example, if you're really trying to think about a whole different type of education system, you can't just put out a new curriculum. You need to start thinking about the interactions between students and teachers, the place and the space. What does a learning guided approach look like? What does a practice-based learning model look like? You need to start redesigning that education system, the pathways into education, the pathways out of education. If you're thinking about things like new electric vehicles, what is the infrastructure, the energy sources that are surrounding that? 3D printers is a really interesting one, actually, because has everyone heard the 3D printers? Yeah, super. So, that really starts to change not just government regulation, where centralization or decentralization of manufacturing, but commerce, demand, and actually for us, what we do and what we want as people and humans as well. So for governments, they're always talking now about making big changes to these big challenges, but they're still concentrating on a new policy or a new service or a new product. Do I have to press a different button?
Just the arrow.
The big button.
The arrow to the right.
Seriously, lovely. No, okay, I'll just move that. So just very quickly on a little journey from the Australian Taxation Office, which I spent a couple of years there. And the Tax Office is a 25,000 person organization. It's very, very large. And one of the goals that we were having was to try and be the custodians of the taxation and superannuation. I think here it might be called pension in some parts of Europe. And towards the end, actually, our role became responding to COVID-19. We played a major role in developing and designing the measures. Now, one of the things that we wanted to do in the tax office is to actually start to think about how do we then bring in a systems-led approach if we are going to want to be custodians of the whole system. So I spearheaded with a few colleagues over there in the branch about how do we actually bring systems thinking and systems change and systems innovation into the world of the tax office. The tax office was quite mature in the use of design thinking, and actually design is a lot more tangible for people in government because they do policy design. So we actually brought it into the design space there, and we created a methodology, not so much maybe a philosophy, maybe a cult, I'm not sure. It became a little bit of that in the ATO called systems-led design. And it really was our attempt to respond to the scale and complexity of the issues. Tax is sexy because it touches the lives of almost every Australian. It's really, really also in our system in Australia, the primary lever government has to then invest in other things that they want to do that helps our community and grows our society as well. And focusing on the individual interactions, the individual policies in the tax office was leading to some challenges, was leading to a range of outcomes we weren't hoping for. It wasn't allowing us to think about the experience that clients have, wasn't allowing us to think about the complexity of the tax system. It's not as complex as other countries, but and how those things actually interact. So we wanted to bring in what we called, systems-led design. And we did use this. I'll just show you. This is a little bit of an old picture. But it really was the explicit incorporation of systems thinking, innovation, behavioral insights, or an understanding of behaviors into the policy design making process. And on the left-hand side of the screen is, I guess, our model. I wouldn't call it a process. It still looks a little bit like a process because people need to visualize something like that. But there's a couple of things there that really emphasize what I believe is important as well. One is the purpose. It's really important to understand with the actors in the space, the purpose of the system you're trying to intervene. There's also an understand the system in there, and there's a whole range of things about seeing the system, thinking in systems, using visualizations to help map the system, understand the interactions within the system. The other couple are probably not designing the change, experimenting and iterating. They're probably not so different. But one of the things, embedding and influence, which is where we started to think about, you need to start to think about, even if you're just taking a policy, to take a systems approach to that, what else needs to happen to make that policy successful in terms of the broad intent there. You can put something new and shiny into a crusty old environment, that thing is going to become crusty and old very, very quickly. So for us, this was a really important part that was still lacking in the tax office. The principles on the right-hand side, really they were there to help us think differently, have an awareness of the system, see the world, help us see different perspectives, put aside our egos, remember the elephant and the blind man on the left, etc. And starting to try and shift us away from being process-oriented to being more purpose-oriented. And we use this in a whole range of different ways. As an example, in the Black economy, for where people are outside of the tax system, for starting to understand the impacts of COVID across the tax and super system. Actually, in order to design some of the measures of COVID, even though that was around designing a certain policy, we started to use systems-led design to start to think about the other interactions that would need to change. Outside of the ATO, we also used it within the ACT government, or these types of principles in advancing domestic and family violence issues. That was another area that I spent a lot of time working in. Often we think about new services, like a new whole of patient or a holistic patients type of service, to support those who have experienced, people with lived experiences around family violence. One of the challenges we saw, as an example, in Australia was that these types of holistic one-stop shop centers sound really, really great in theory, but in practice, some people don't want to access the stigma around accessing a big one-stop shop, sitting over there, about walking in there. Many people can't actually access it because they're in controlling environments. So we started to actually rethink the whole system and brought together actors. And that was challenging, and Joss and I might even talk a little bit about challenges, but one of the biggest challenges there when we started to try to invite the actors in that we needed to, this included people from different sectors, lawyers, those from NGO, the finance sector, etc., to start to rethink how, for example, money flowed, information flowed, who interacted with people with lived experiences, was power. Power is a really big challenge for government because in the end, there was a few things. There's accountability structures in government. Actually, in this particular case, it was government who was funding the initiative, and that already creates a power imbalance. So these were types of challenges that we needed to start to think about as we started to use a method or an approach such as systems thinking or systems innovation. Which is my really long point to where I'm trying to go to, which is systems innovation requires more than just systems-led design or systems thinking or an innovation lab or anything like that. Government is just one actor in a broader ecosystem, and that's different to some of the traditional ways that government have worked in before. It requires practices, approaches, mental models, philosophies, ways of thinking that are often not aligned to some of the more traditional policy or public administration models. And it also therefore requires a fundamental change to the foundations of government. So in the OECD, one of the working papers just released actually, so it's in a draft form, but it's basically an analytical framework for examining and strengthening the innovative capacity of public sector systems. there's a few things to call out, and then I'll actually just walk you through a little bit of it, but it is available online, so you can start to see it online and have a look at it. But the first one is that it's embedded. It's instead of starting to examine the innovation specific system within governments, it's about actually trying to understand the public sector system itself, because innovation cannot be decoupled from it. Starting to understand the governing mechanisms, things like skills, your audit, your regulatory frameworks, your legislative models, your mechanisms for interacting with citizens, with interacting with other stakeholders, your procurement, etc. The second is that it's systemic. It's about focusing on the public sector system, not just an individual part, although it can be tailored towards certain levels of government, towards, say, systems innovation, towards a policy domain. So it's a flexible framework. And it's also about iterativeness. So it doesn't tell you you have to be at a certain end goal. It's about trying to help governments understand why they need to work differently, their goals and their ambitions, and start to think about the areas they might want to push in their system to operate differently. How it's constructed, just to show you very quickly, is there's sort of 4 themes. The first is around purpose, and that's really around what is the intent that needs us to innovate, to think differently, to do things differently in government. The second one is around potential, and that's really about what elements are in the system that influence whether efforts to be innovative, to innovate, for innovation can actually be attempted and can actually pierce through the public sector system. The third one is capacity. It's a very big word. It means lots of different things, but really this is about what is needed to carry out the innovative efforts. Do we have the right skills, resources, things actually on the ground, the nitty gritty, and is it integrated with government practice? And so even for those of you who aren't in government, a lot of you would be probably hitting up against walls around certain elements that I'll talk about shortly. And if you're in consulting model, often these are the things that they'll try to get you to redesign from their organization. And finally, impact. So this is around not just the impact of innovative efforts, but how do we think about the impact of the efforts of public sectors generally? While we have levels of analysis, we do have an individual, organizational, public sector, system, environmental. They are all part of the system. It's actually just to help synthesis and make it more practical and operationalizable. This just shows you a little bit of what sits underneath the framework. So basically underneath the framework for each of those 4 themes and each of those levels of analysis are a whole range of factors that we start to examine when we work with countries. And for example, at the moment, we're working with Romania and Latvia, and we have done with many other countries, starting to examine their public sector systems for innovative capacity. So just as an example, when we're thinking about purpose, you might have your intrinsic motivation as an individual, you've got your organizational strategies, but you've also got things that the public sector system starts, for example, your global pressures, your international standards, your EU standards, which in Europe is a very strong influencer, your political agendas, your reform agendas, crises, these sorts of things. Here are a range of different parts of the framework. So as an example, capacity is a really big one. When we look at capacity, even though the whole framework's called capacity actually, but when we look at the capacity factor or theme, we start to think about it from individuals' perspective. It's that mindset, it's the practical ability, it's the space that they work in, the dynamics within their teams. For organizations and across organizations, their portfolio management, their funding models, their workforce strategy, their workforce practices, their culture. At a systems level, there's flexibility of rules, regulatory frameworks, legislative frameworks, the openness and connectedness. And I'll actually talk through a little bit more details specific to systems innovation, so I won't spend any more time on that slide. But underneath each of those sections is a very long set of signals. And I sometimes don't like to use the word signals because I know this can also mean sort of weak signals and it can mean different things in different contexts, but they're sort of the things you are looking for and how we might collect the data. So it actually comes down to being very practical. So it's operationalizable. This is just a bit of an example of then how we use it in certain countries. This is some images pulled for Romania. We actually started to use the framework. It created a lot of analysis through using surveys, using workshops, using contextual inquiry, focus groups, interviews, a lot of desktop analysis and research, literature reviews. And we started to actually go really nitty-gritty into each of the factors. And that will eventually sort of creates a little bit of a heat map on the top right for us. Underneath that, we've got a range of different sort of visuals where we're starting to mapping out the actors, etc. We're just at the start of this Romania journey at the moment. But we use the framework as a really good synthesis, practical framework to help us actually think about it. So just on the 4 areas, and I've just combined purpose and potential. When we're thinking about building capacity of public sector systems to do systems innovation, there's many things around this area we can start to think about. So as an example, what is the overarching purpose, the mandate, strategies that are coming down into governments? Are they grand missions? Are they very specific? Is there a very specific response? Do they have whole of system goals? Do they have goals across the entire public sector, or is it very specific to certain functions? What are the political mandates at play as well? Hello. Do they demonstrate longer term thinking, or are they, you know, in government, very aligned to political cycles, which in many countries are very, very short? Are individuals and organizations actually clearly aware of these strategies? Do they understand how they play a part in the broader missions or grand scales of purpose and strategy? And do leaders have things like the right risk appetite? This is something that's influenced by many things, by scrutiny, by audit procedures, by previous experiences, by accountability structures. But is that geared in a way that allows people to think at a whole of system level, that allows people to innovate, that allows experimentation, that allows for the uncertainty? And what is the general appetite for that risk and innovation and experimentation? And what external pressures are there? Those external pressures can actually be a good thing to harness and leverage. For example, in Romania, there is extensive citizen pressure on government due to its historical context. So being able to find trust and transparency in public institutions in Romania is such a strong driver that it's actually something we can use to rethink the way government works. Then there's other things such as decentralization and centralization. This can affect whether you can actually start to see at whole system levels and governments can actually work at whole of system levels, but also for the diffusion on the other side. How well connected are they in a decentralized form, not just in government, but with other stakeholders and other sectors? In terms of capacity, this is a really, really huge one, actually. And this one is difficult. And this quote here is I think, very true. A lot of things that makes government work and has made it work for so long are actually the things that make it difficult for them to embrace the new. So for individuals here, you know, do we have the right skill sets, the right methods, the right mindsets, the right tools? Now, implementing a new innovation process is just one part of this type of thinking. We need to start to embed that. And are there right spaces and types of opportunities for individuals to actually work in these types of new ways? Funding models. This is a really big one for public sectors. They're often not iterative. You often have to bid for funding models for very many years with very specific outputs, not really thinking about the whole system when you're putting up policy cases or new policy proposals. What about procurement models? Do they allow us to think about government as just one part of the broader value chain and actually leverage the expertise of different sectors and procure them into what we do and what we put out? So systems innovations also has to require governments to find the right people, find the right actors in the system, those who can influence and bring them together to create systems change. And this starts to question the role of government itself. And this is something we're doing a lot. If we want to build the capacity of public sectors to do that, we need to get them to start seeing their role in a slightly different way. And this starts to think about mechanisms to partner, to work with others. Same with interoperability and data sharing. I don't call that out too much because the main thing people talk about, I think, when we ever discuss this is technology and data as the major issues. So I won't spend too much time on that one. I think we know that. But data and interoperability helps governments think about different types of data, and I know that's another conversation in itself, but different types of evidence and different types of data that helps them see the whole picture, helps them actually understand the system, helps them to actually think about leverage points and do that in a way that government needs to, if we're thinking about current government operations where evidence-based policy is really important due to the accountability frameworks. And sometimes we need to be pragmatic. We can't completely change what government looks like. So we do have to work within some of the parameters. And I think this is one of the biggest learnings I have as someone who's been in government for a long time. Sometimes you have to know how to push with the grain, not completely try and push against the grain, or be too idealistic there. And finally, impact. Impact is a really difficult topic, but here it's, the types of mechanisms we have in place to think about things that are not just things that we do or things that we produce, but how that might interact, the directions it's starting to take shape. Maybe we need to start challenging our thoughts of outcomes. Maybe we need to start thinking about how do we measure our movement of the systems towards certain areas. In government, for example, many governments are just starting to think about indirect or connected types of effects from a policy in a certain area, because you're starting to see that governments realize that you cannot close a boundary too narrowly around certain policy areas. So these are the types of things that you might need to think about around building capacity of public sectors to do systems innovation. Another big one is using more contemporary models or more participatory models of evaluation. Governments to start to invite others into that evaluation and monitoring processes as well. So this is just, I think, one of the things that I think about here, which is one of the things that we, in our generations at the moment, in our world at the moment, is really, really powerful. And that is that we actually need to start with ourselves. And if we change our inner attitudes and minds, we can change the outer aspects of our lives. And the one thing I want to say on this actually is, I have used this in a few different contexts, balancing idealism and pragmatism. One of the things I really believe in is that we do, as people who really believe in the change and the effects of doing systems work, we have to dream the impossible. We have to try and aim to strive for things that others haven't been able to imagine. But we also have to be pragmatic. Sometimes I think, particularly in government, we see an us and a them, the innovation community and everyone else in policy making, etc. Those in the systems community and everyone else who really doesn't get it. They just don't get it. And that actually does not help to shift, to build, to work within those public sector systems that are imperfect, that are constrained, and there's many reasons for that. So I think for me, one of the things for us is for us to actually also remember that we talk a lot about being in others' shoes, about being open. And sometimes we are not like that in systems communities as well. So that's my little moment. Now here in OPSI, I think many of you already know, so I won't spend too much time here. We do a lot of work in terms of trying to understand the world around innovative things, trends, things that are happening, but helping governments really start to bring that into their governing mechanisms and being able to turn into the new normals, an interesting tagline for it, but being able to help them embed new capacities into their governing mechanisms. And this is one of the reasons we built this framework, because it really helps us understand at an entire systemic level how their governing mechanisms are either enabling them or not enabling them to do innovative work, such as systems innovation. So thank you very much. That went a little bit longer than expected. So Joss, I'm open to different options for what we do at this point.
So we've just got 10 minutes left.
Yes.
So maybe we have some questions.
Sure.
I'm sure there's lots of interesting people here who have interesting questions. That was great.
Thanks.
Revives my confidence in public sector. And it really is a paradigm shift, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
And you think about those institutions, they were really born in the industrial age, weren't they? They were born in that mentality of kind of command and control. And now we're asking for something totally different. to be kind of platforms, they've got to be orchestrating ecosystems, they've got to be collaborating with others. And you say they're just one actor in that ecosystem, but they're a very special actor, aren't they? For a lot of those governments, they have a legitimacy because they're democratic that other institutions don't have, and they have the legal frameworks and so forth, so they really can be potentially, so often doesn't happen, but potentially they could be really amazing platforms for orchestrating and creating the kind of innovation ecosystems that we need. But hugely challenging. It's that paradigm shift that kind of takes a jump. But I loved your idealism and pragmatism. It was really good. Okay, so questions? Yep. Jeff.
Hi, thanks, Misha, for a great talk. So one of the things that I've been wondering about for years now is when we're trying to lead systems change, and often if that's happening sort of from the bottom up, community organizations, foundations, or other actors kind of going ahead, and the question is then how do you get government to either take ownership at some point, or follow the journey, or be involved in whatever case. And also coming back to your experience in Australia, what's your sense? Should the work be done up front, or in what kind of way should the work be done up front in terms of getting government to take ownership from the start? The risk is you obviously slow things down, the ambition level will be lower, and so on. Or is there what are ways to use the word capacity to build the capacity of government to take part in that system journey along the way? What are some practices you've seen that are interesting?
Yeah, it's a really, really good point, because I think it's a big debate that's going on. If you want something done at that real national level, sometimes it feels that it needs government to really be at the forefront of it, and yet for lots of reasons government are too slow, etc. So many of you probably do work around systems change, and you do it at the community level, the regional level, because it's easier to make things go forward. And I don't think there's a simple or easy answer, but I do think there is a risk with trying to think about how government takes ownership of it at some point, because that already starts to heighten that power imbalance that happens at some point. So I think, Jesper, the part that you said at the second part, in terms of how do you actually build the capacity of governments to understand their role in the broader ecosystem and design those ecosystems to be able to take part in that systems change. And that is the one thing, like taking the domestic and family violence example, that is the part we started to think about. We started to try and remove power from government and start for all of them to actually map out their roles and how government plays it. Funding is very powerful, but we made it just one input into the system. And I think that is the better way, instead of having government take over it or start, etc. Now, in saying that, I'm not sure that can work in all cases. So for me, I think there is a lot of power in how can communities come together to influence government at a national level, because often the challenges happening at the community level are the issues that government wants to tackle at a national level as well.
Hi, great presentation, thank you. I wonder if you had a tip for me, because right now I'm working with crisis management operations, and our customers are one of the most conservative and hierarchical ministries in Finland. So what would be the sort of the first very powerful steps you would take, which would open up for them a new vision, a new window? Okay, so there we should go.
Good. It's interesting that you mentioned that from Finland, because we actually do a lot of work with Finland, and they are, for us, one of the most advanced in these spaces. So I don't know the areas that you're working with, but maybe I can share with you some of the areas in Finland that we do work with, because there's not actually many countries where we do work with them on areas such as, for example, embedding anticipation into their governing mechanisms. And Finland is one of these areas that we do a lot of work around this in. So I'm happy to share that with you. But I think in terms of the most conservative groups generally, part of it is to understand why, when you're doing things like crisis management in government, when you're doing things that you're in certain audit functions, you're in certain scrutiny functions, there's often a reason. So for me, I do think there's always a need for systems innovation, but it's good to question, actually, governments have many, many roles, and innovating is just one strategic function within that. Is that the right type of strategic function to take at this point? The second thing I find that's really useful is to try and, I don't like to say ask for forgiveness, but a little bit of ask for forgiveness. Sometimes it's very difficult to convince people, particularly of things that sound as intangible as systems and that kind of thing. So it's really about showing them, about trying to take them through it in practice, about trying to do a few things just softly and seeing if they react or notice to it without saying, by the way, I'm trying a systems approach here. About bringing things in. So, when you're doing crisis management, you might actually just start to visualize some of the interactions and show them, actually, you've got a risk here and you've got a risk here, and this might be influencing it. I find that's more useful than trying to push people towards an area that they're not going to be pushed in government.
I'll just say also, I mean, generally, obviously that's a challenge in systems change generally, but more broadly, we're operating as well with all these linear organizations. And many ways of going about it, but one is that, if that linear organization is operating in a complex environment, there'll always be cracks, it'll be good at some things, right? But there'll always be places where it's not successful, right? So here in the UK, the government has basically not improved on inequality, or poverty is basically like this, right? They've done a whole pile around it. So that's a problem that you can go and say, well, guys, we're not making progress. There's always cracks there, and you want to find those cracks, those places where this linear system is bumping up against a complex challenge and it's just not working. And they're probably pushed under the carpet, but you want to highlight that and say, look, guys, this is not working. And case studies are always, or examples, are always great, saying, oh, look, this other country similar to us did this and it worked. Let's give it a try, because we haven't made any progress on this.
And I think we do have a crack already, because part of our assignment is to evaluate the Afghanistan operation. And we don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think it's a really good point there, because actually that is the reason that for the Department of Employment, that journey of systems approaches started. We actually went with a stakeholder in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander outcomes, where they basically were like, we'll try whatever because it's not working anyway. We don't really believe in what you're doing, but if you want to do it. It was that kind of attitude at the time, because they were basically desperate. With that, we were able to use it. So I think it's a really good point about thinking of those cracks, even when it sounds like these people might not be convinced. It actually started a really, really big move, a big transformative change around the system of that organization.
Yeah, and that should be the competitive advantage here, right? If we have a complexity approach that's supposed to work in a complex environment, well, then it should work, right? And people should be, receptive to that. Like, if they see something that actually works, then there should be an opening. Okay, who else?
Sorry, yes.
So I think it was related. I work in government, so I totally relate to some of the constraints that we have to work under, and I think it's right that we need to work with those constraints, with the grain, and figure out what we can change. I think one of the basic things I wanted to know, and just be aware, I've only discovered this a few months ago, less than a year ago, and it's refreshing to see people who've been doing it for years. I was like, where was I? But when you adopt this approach to the ATO, are you looking at, we could improve everything, or are you looking at particular parts to improve? And I ask this because as working in government, we have ownership, if you like, on policies on particular areas, and not everybody is minded to have this approach. So you're going to be working with people who, like me previously, would know about this. And my logic tells me that, okay, the utopia out there, we need to build a way towards it. So by the time I leave this post, at least it's on the right journey. So I think it's trying to implement it as a one-man band onwards, and kind of educating people as you go along, bringing them into that approach. But I don't know if you target the wider thing first.
The wider from a policy perspective, or you mean the organization? Like, did we target implementing it in part, in a bit of both? I mean, to be really honest, it was a part, because we had to start with a part. And even now, I do wonder, how the ATO is going on that journey of its change, because a lot of critical people had left. But one of the things we found was that we did start it as a method or an approach that we would apply to certain policy areas that we were designing. So we started really not at that whole of systems level at the part, but what that started to do was catalyze certain other people within the organization, because it's such a big organization. A lot of people have very thin, narrow accountability structures, but it started to catalyze a range of change. People started to want to work differently, not just with our branch, which almost acted as consultants at the time to support the business areas in the design of policies. And it started to get people to ask for different ways of doing, for example, project management. And in the end, we changed the entire organization's project management approaches from the very strict stage gate approach to more iterative. So it almost started, we didn't think it would catalyze the change, but we started to then think a lot about, okay, we implemented it originally because we wanted a new method to deal with complex issues. And actually what it's done is it started to catalyze a change systemically to the organization. And it started to then call for the commissioner to be a steward. And what did that look like? And then you had people starting to say, well, we can't actually do this just in our organization because tax interacts with the other policy domains. So we started to see that magnitude effect. But to be really honest, it started with myself, Luke, who Sharon knows, and I would say an amazing 100 people in my branch who were just amazing. And it just grew out from there. But it really started with 2 of us trying to convince a tent, another tent, and then it catalyzed change well outside of just people. I'm sorry, I know it's over time.
No, it's going great. It's perfectly on time.